Wie geht's? Kultur in Zeiten des Coronavirus. Welcome to this international edition of Wie geht's, a podcast of conversations with people working in the arts, cultural policy and the creative sector, reflecting on how the coronavirus crisis affects the cultural sphere. I'm Martin Zierold, Director of the Institute for Arts and Media Management at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Hamburg, Germany, which is producing this podcast. Theatres, museums, clubs, cinemas, the whole cultural sphere is under lockdown in many places all over Europe and beyond. Yet, culture still has a key role in many people's lives. Watching movies, making music or fine art, reading novels, playing complex games, and reading poetry. Poetry, so it seemed in more than one of this podcast's past conversations, has even gained attention in the pandemic, as a number of people have turned to poems to find focus, solace, entertainment and inspiration, to name but a few ways to appreciate poetry. So it is high time that we have a poet as a guest in this podcast. And I'm honored and delighted that Wendy Cope, a poet I personally adore, has agreed to join in for today's episode. Wendy Cope has worked for 15 years as a primary school teacher in London. Her first collection of poems, Making Cocoa for Kingsley Amis, was published in 1986 and became an immediate bestseller. Her 2011 collection of poems, Family Values, has been chosen amongst The Telegraph's 15 best poetry books of all times, and her most recent collection, Anecdotal Evidence, was published in 2018. Wendy has kindly agreed to read 2 poems from this book in today's podcast. She's received numerous awards and edited a number of wonderful collections of poetry, amongst them a collection Funny Side of 101 humorous poems. A great entry point into her work is provided by the collection 2 Cures for Love, with selected poems of hers from 1979 to 2006. The title of this podcast, Wie geht's?, has a double meaning. It translates as "How are you?" into English. We want to know how people in the cultural realm are doing during these extraordinary and challenging times. Yet, Wie geht's also means "How does it work?" On this podcast, we hope to share fresh ideas, learnings, stories, how we learn to rethink our practices and our role for societies in the light of the current crisis. I'm looking forward to talk to Wendy Cope now about these questions. I'm connected via Zoom with Wendy Cope, a poet from Great Britain, and I'm really delighted to have the chance to talk to you, Wendy. Thank you very much for taking the time. We'll be talking about the role of poetry in the current crisis and also your own work in this current moment. But the first question in the podcast is always the same question, and in German it would be Wie geht's? In English it is how are you?
Mir geht's good. I'm fine.
Which is very good news, because it's unlike other moments when it's very easy to say mir geht's gut. It's not self-evident that people are doing okay in the current moment. When I talk to artists on the podcast, I did not dare so far to ask them to perform any of their work, but it's also got to do because I didn't talk with writers so far. You agreed that it'd be okay to read a poem to start our conversation,
yeah.
And you chose yourself something that's meaningful to you in the current moment. So I'm really curious to learn what poem you chose.
It's called To My Husband. It's a sonnet. Because, of course, I've spent a lot of time with my husband this year, and I've worried that one of us might get ill. I mean, this poem I wrote several years ago, but I think it's relevant now. If we were never going to die, I might not hug you quite as often or as tight, or say goodbye to you as carefully if I were certain you'd come back to me. Perhaps I wouldn't value every day, every act of kindness, every laugh as much if I knew you and I could stay forever as each other's other half. We may not have too many years before one disappears to the eternal yonder and I can't hug or touch you anymore. Yes, of course, that knowledge makes us fonder. Would I want to change things if I could and make us both immortal? Love, I would.
Thank you very much. That's a very moving poem, and I think it really does speak to the current moment on many levels. And maybe it can be really an opener for the conversation, because this fear of getting ill, this fear of how the current situation might change lives, I think is something that's shared across also generations at the current
The worst
moment.
fear is one of us going off in an ambulance and we never see each other again. I mean, these stories of people dying alone in hospital are just so terrible.
Yeah. A poem that I really adore and turn to in the current situation that you've written is called Que Sera Sera, and it plays on that song, and there's the
I nearly read that one, and yeah.
And that also is about like the futility of trying to shape the future, and how much we don't have the power to actually do that.
Well, I didn't read it was because it's very important at the moment to be careful. And I thought that poem perhaps suggested, just doing whatever you want and not being very careful about obeying all the rules of the lockdown and so on. So that was why I didn't choose that one. Yeah. It sounds a bit carefree, and it can't be carefree at the moment.
I can see that. There's this element to that. In a way, this leads me to the question, and I told you that when I approached you, many people I talked to on the podcast, when I asked them for where they find solace or inspiration, they say poetry. And a number of them said they're turning more to poetry right now than they did in months or years before the COVID crisis. Is that an experience that you share?
No, I don't think I've turned to poetry. I have to admit, in the last year, I don't think I've turned to poetry any more than I did before. Although quite a few of my poems, people have been sort of putting poems on websites and so on. Quite a lot of people have asked, could they put certain poems of mine on the websites they're compiling for people to read during the crisis. I have read a lot this year, but no more poetry, I think, than I usually would.
Yeah.
It's quite a small part of my reading, if I'm honest.
Yeah. And you also mentioned in our before we started recording that you're not working on poetry at the moment.
I'm not. Now, this is nothing to do with the pandemic.
Yeah.
I had stopped writing poetry before all this began. And I just feel, it may change, but I feel at the moment that my work is finished as a poet. I have said what I want to say. And I just don't... ich habe keine Lust for writing poetry. Mm-hmm. I just don't feel like it. And the difference is that in the past, I've had phases where I didn't write any poetry and it worried me. And I was, I wished I could. And at the moment now, I'm really not worried about it. I've written quite a lot. I'm pleased with what I've written. And if I don't write any more, I don't feel it's too terrible. I mean, George Herbert, who's one of my favourite poets, died when he was 39. Right? Now, if he'd lived another 40 years and not written any more poems, it'd all be the same now. I also think about the fact that Shakespeare retired. But it's not that I haven't been writing anything. I can tell you what I've been doing, if you like. My lockdown projects. One of my lockdown projects is trying to improve my German with the Babbel app. So I do about 10 minutes German, jeden Tag. But that's another of my... I have been writing a diary, and I started this in November 2019. And the idea was it would be a diary of my working life. There's a book by a bookseller called Sean Bithell, who wrote a book called Diary of a Bookseller, which is a very entertaining book about all the things that happen in his bookshop, secondhand bookshop. And I'd had this idea, I'd write a book about the working life of a poet, and things that happen when I used to travel around a lot doing poetry readings and things that people asked me to do, sometimes ridiculous things that people asked me and so on. And also, he also put at the end of each day how much money he'd taken. And so I was putting at the end of each day how much money I'd been paid for whatever, just so people see poets don't earn very much money. So I started this diary, but of course my working life sort of pretty well disappeared. I mean, all my events were cancelled, and but the other thing I've been doing is sorting out, I mean, a lot of people have been doing this, clearing out cupboards. So I found a huge suitcase of old photographs, and I have been sorting out these old photographs, trying to work out when and where things happened, and I've put them in albums. I started off with my great-grandfather. And it's not a photograph, it's a sort of print of my great-grandfather. So it starts with a few photographs of ancestors, and then it goes on through my life, and I've got up to 2015, haven't quite finished. And of course, a lot of my photos are on my phone, but I've managed to get them converted into prints. And what's happened is that working with these photographs, of course, it's brought back memories. So a lot of what I've been writing about in the diary is things that happened in my life that I've been reminded of by the photographs. So it's turned out to be a quite different kind of diary from the one that I intended to write in the first place.
Yeah. And is it meant for publication? So is it a project?
Well, there is the publisher who's interested, because I did publish a prose book a few years ago of various sort of bits of journalism and so on. And the publisher of that is interested, but she hasn't seen it yet. And I can't quite make up my mind to send it to her. I mean, 2 reasons. One, she might just think it's boring. And the other is that I'm not sure if I want to publish it, because then I'll have to sort of go on a publicity tour and all that stuff. And I'm just not sure if I can face it at the moment. Not having to do any poetry readings, not having to travel around doing events has been absolutely wonderful. I didn't realise how stressful it was till it stopped. And now it's stopped. I don't know. I mean, I'm 75, I don't know if I want to, and I've got 1 or 2 health problems. I don't know if I want to do that again, but I probably will send it to her eventually. But I don't know if any. I imagine reviews saying, this is all about a middle-class white woman and who cares in the present climate.
Yeah. At the same time, I mean, people who like reading your poetry will surely be interested in
I know. And I mean, I have this sort of war in my mind, because I do have a feeling about poems as well, that because I'm a middle-class white woman, no one will be interested. And then I have to remind myself that's just the media and the poetry world, that I still have readers out there who would like to read some more things by me. Yeah. And they're mostly middle-class white women, but, I think they're allowed to read books as well.
And men.
And some men, yes. And they're not all white, and they're not all middle-aged. No.
Yeah. As you so strictly in a way said, like, I'm not writing any poetry right now, and it's the first time you feel fine about that. At the same time, you've got these writing projects. Is writing poetry as a process, as an experience, fundamentally different to you than writing this prose?
I think for poetry, there has to be strong emotion about something. I mean, it might be about how beautiful the world is, it might be how beautiful something is, or it might be how sad something is, or whereas with prose that's not true. And of course, having spent so much of my life writing poems in rhyming forms, it's so much easier. So it's so much easier writing prose.
Yeah. At the same time, if the strong emotion is a core in a way, somehow I would expect that the current moment is a moment of very strong emotions for practically everybody experiencing it, and to have this outlet where you've got this proficiency.
Do you know? I mean, I'm worried now because the situation in the UK has suddenly got much worse, and I'm scared. But my husband and I we were talking on New Year's Eve, and we agreed that 2020 for us had been a happy year. I mean. We're very aware terrible things happening to other people, but we've been together at home a lot. We've got on very well together. I thought he might get fed up with being stuck at home, but he hasn't got fed up. And I think, because I didn't have the stress of doing all these things that I normally do, we've actually been happier. There are times when I've longed to be able to I can't get very far. We don't have a car anymore. So we're very limited where we can get to. We did have one wonderful day out where we were able to walk in the woods and everything. We have got some green spaces near us, and that's been very important, going for walks. We go for 2 walks every day. But I haven't really minded. And until the last week or 2, last 2 or 3 weeks, I wasn't really too scared. I mean, very occasionally I'd worry that one of us would get ill, but it hasn't been too bad.
Which is good, and let's hope it gets better from how it is right now quickly. As you mentioned, the happiness and in a way that the strong emotion in poetry very often is not around happiness, although sometimes it is. And you're the editor of a wonderful collection of 101 happy poems. What's your take on this notion that poetry very often is not about happiness?
I agree there's this saying, happiness writes white, and you see this quoted all over the place, and it's just not true. And it annoyed me that people kept saying this when it's obviously not true. You think, say, of Wordsworth's Daffodils, which is about the best known poem in the English language. It's I do say in my introduction, I think misery writes more good poems than happiness. And a lot of my poems, a lot of my poems were about love affairs that went wrong. And then my life got happier. And there was a phase where I didn't write very much, but then I did. But of course, there have been times in my life where I was so miserable that writing a poem was the only thing to do. And it did save my sanity times when I was really, really low. And I managed to write a poem, and somehow putting the feelings exactly into words and giving them some shape and making some order, that does help. What I'm feeling at the moment is, my fears and worries, like in that poem I wrote, I worry about dying. I worry about my husband dying. I've written about that quite a lot already. I suppose that's what I feel. And I don't know that I have anything new to say about it.
Yeah. And another question I had also in preparing this interview is that somehow the work of a poet, and it could even say the business model of being a poet, is something I guess many people, and I include myself, that don't have a good idea about, because in a way there's this romantic idea of somebody sitting at a desk and writing these poems somehow magically even. But actually to like live as a poet involves so much more. And you mentioned that, for example, like being on tour, doing the readings is a very important part of it, and that has stopped right now. So how is the life of a poet if there wasn't COVID? How would you describe the job description in a way of being a poet?
He's making a noise up there. I don't have as much time for writing as people might think, because there's quite a lot of going around doing poetry readings. And this is because I needed the money. I think I can manage without it now. I've got another pension. And also, it's quite a nice ego trip. You go and you read to a room full of people and they're all very nice to you and they laugh and clap and they come and get their books signed, and that's nice. What's not so good is all the travelling, making the travelling arrangements, worrying that the train will be late, that you'll miss your connection, and sort of the admin. But I'm not saying I'll never do any of it again. But I think I don't want to travel too far. I like it. I don't like to have to pack a bag. And I got really fed up with packing a bag and going away overnight, and then you don't sleep, and so it takes up 2 whole days. So there's that, and then there's people. I do a bit of journalism. I do a little bit. Of course, I've been able to go on doing that. I've written a few articles during the year, and I'm very grateful for that work because I can do it at home. And judging poetry competitions, I quite often get asked to do that, and I think I've done a couple this year. I always ask if I'm asked to judge a competition. My husband's also a poet. Not as well known, but if I'm judging, I always ask if he can be my co-judge, because he's going to help me anyway, so he might as well get the credit. And so there's that. And sometimes I get commissioned to write poems on a particular subject, and sometimes I say yes and sometimes I say no. It depends whether it interests me. But that's quite good, because it's somebody giving you an idea for something to write about, and you just have to find an angle on it that you can relate to. Yes, judging. I used to do teaching. I used to go and teach on short creative writing courses. These days in the UK, most published poets have jobs as teachers of creative writing. but I've never had a full-time job as a teacher of creative writing. There wasn't so much of it. I mean, when I was younger, there weren't not so many of those kind of jobs available. So I used to do teaching on short courses, but I don't do that anymore. And I have to deal with a lot of correspondence, sometimes from people who want me to tell them if their poems are any good, or if to tell them how I can help them get published. And this is a pain, really. I mean, I didn't send my poems to published poets when I was getting going, and I don't have much patience with it. So I usually, I have various ways of dealing with it, but I try not to spend too much time on it. I mean, if someone sends me their poems and they're actually good, which is very rare indeed, I will do what I can to help them. But they're not often. Certainly not often. And then they send me their self-published books, and I'm supposed to, say something about that. Anyway, yes, I think I've covered the things I do. And I have travelled. I mean, one great thing about being a poet is that I have travelled all over the place in the past. I've been, America, Hong Kong, Sri Lanka. I've been to Germany a lot. I really like coming to Germany. I've done readings in Augsburg, Leipzig, Berlin. I really like coming to Germany. I find German people very kind and helpful, but the one thing that's annoying is that when they're trying to learn German, they won't let you, because if you try and speak to a German person in German, they immediately start talking English. And I don't know if they want to show off how good their English is, or they're just being kind. So I found the only German conversations I had were with ethnic minority taxi drivers, because they didn't know any. Whereas it's quite different in France. If you speak bad French to a French person, they pretend they can't understand you at all. Germans are much nicer.
Yeah, I think we've been telling ourselves in a way that it's impolite to expect other people that they should be able to speak German. So I think that's one of the strong reasons why.
I mean, I'm ashamed of the English. I mean, with languages, it's shameful that we do. I mean, we do French. All of us do French for 4 or 5 years at school, and none of us can speak it. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and where's your interest in German coming from? Is it through these travels, or is it?
I did German at school for O level, which is the exam, used to be the exam you do at 16. And then I spent a month in Germany between school and university. I did a month at a Goethe Institute outside Munich. And then I sort of forgot it all. And then in the 1980s, I had a German boyfriend who was a poet from Frankfurt. And so my German got quite good then, although his English, of course, we mostly spoke English because his English was good, but my German did get better. So, I have phases where my German, and just while we were in lockdown, I thought, right, I'm going to try and get better at German. So that's why I'm doing these 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah.
10 oder 15 Minuten with mit meinem Handy.
Yeah, very good. But returning to the job of a poet, and maybe like zooming out and taking a look at the field right now, I realized actually in preparing also our conversation that my idea of how poets work is wrong on many levels, and because before I had this idea that poets aren't affected that much by the corona crisis because they can still write poems.
Yes.
At the same time, you mentioned that a lot of where the money comes in, they can't do at this moment. So do you see the field affected? Do you hear from younger poets or?
Well, I think poets? Yes. I think for a lot of poets, it's a terrible problem, and the Society of Authors has started a fund. There has some help from some people can get some help from the government. Some self-employed people can get some help from the government, but a lot of them are not eligible. And I think for some young poets, there's some poets we call performance poets who depend entirely on going around performing their poems. So anyone who's a performer, any kind of performer, this has been terrible. And most poets don't make much money from the sales of their books. I've been luckier than most. My first 2 books were bestsellers. I don't make quite so much money now. But yes, it has. I think it is a problem for anyone who's involved in performance, and that includes most poets.
Yeah, and you mentioned a bit how like the field has also changed over the last years, not just through COVID. What's your view of the poetry community, if you could say, or the poetry scene at the moment? Do you see inspiring, interesting new stuff happening? Is there a need for
yeah, occasionally I get a new. I belong to a thing called the Poetry Book Society, so I get a new. They send new books of poetry, and then sometimes I read about something that I want to look at. And my husband probably buys more new poetry than I do. Quite a lot of these books, newly published books that I get sent, I don't get anything from reading them at all. Now and again, I get one. There's one by a Chinese British poet called, what's her name, Mary Chan? Just trying to remember. Mary Jean Chan. Yeah, I enjoyed that one. So, yeah, but a lot of new poetry that's being published, I either can't understand it or I don't get anything from it. I'm quite limited in my tastes in poetry.
I'm sure there's no recipe, but is there something that poems share which you personally like?
Well, I like it if I can understand them. And I mean, this is a problem a lot of people have with poetry, that a lot of poets seem to be writing in code for each other. I mean, I'm not stupid. I am a poet myself. I am an experienced reader of poetry, but so much of it I can't understand. And my husband, who's more of an intellectual than I am, he probably understands more things than I do. But sometimes we'll both read a book and we'll say, I really could not understand this at all. And it's in the English language, but we couldn't understand it at all. And that happens quite a lot. So, I mean, I think if we can't understand it, who's it for? That's the feeling I have about a lot of poetry that's published at the moment.
Yeah, and who do you think it's for?
Other poets. And they give each other prizes.
So it's a lot of like self-stabilizing system in a way, but a closed system. Then, yeah. It's actually something I really, I think I love about your poetry, and one of the reasons why I'm returning to it again and again, in different situations and also different personal, emotional situations, is that I find it somehow has got this magical sweet spot of being accessible in the way of you can understand it on various levels, and yet not leaving you with the feeling that it's easy stuff. There's a richness to it and a complexity to it, and I imagine that probably is the hardest from at all to achieve, like this being accessible and complex.
Well, I really thank you very much. I mean, I thank you very much indeed for saying that. Some people despise my work because it's too easy. I just have to try not to mind about that. But I thank you very much for saying what you said.
Yeah. Looking for like I mean, that was one of the ways for me to be able to return to poetry. And like on a personal note, I had a grandfather who was very into poetry. And he made his own collections. I mean, not writing them, but just poems he liked and printed them.
That's a good thing to
do. So I, as a grandkid, I was growing up, and he could had lots of poems he could speak by heart and everything. So in a way, I was lucky that I, in a very young age, was close to poetry in a way. At the same time, I didn't read poetry as an adult for a long time, and actually, your poets were one of those which made it easy for me to return to it and find new ways of appreciating them.
Thank you.
If you were to recommend to somebody who's no idea what poetry can do for you in life, why should someone read poetry, and how to start reading poetry for a complete newbie?
I think the way to start is to look at an anthology, of different poets. And what I say to people is you don't have to like everything. Alan Bennett once said there should be a notice outside the National Gallery saying you don't have to like everything. And I think this is, people come across one poem that they don't like or they don't understand, and they think poetry is not for me. And what the point is, if you find anything that moves you or that you want to read again, if it's just one or two poems, then you can respond to poetry. And an anthology is a good place to find those poets who you can relate to and enjoy and be moved by. And then you can branch out and look for more poems by those poets. So I think that's the way to do it.
And in terms of looking at the anthologies, I always struggle, like looking at the second anthology in a way, and the third one, that there seems to be this canon of poems you find in all of them. And a lot of them are very old, and sometimes I find it actually much more easy to relate to 20th century poetry than some of the classics.
Right.
And it's much harder, I find, to find good anthologies that don't just reproduce a kind of very traditional canon.
Right. Well, you're talking about German anthologies, are you?
English as well, actually.
English as well. Right. Well, there's quite a lot. There's an anthology came out this year called Staying Human. And I got sent a copy because I'm in it. But it's a huge anthology, and it's just about all in copyright. There's a few things by dead poets, but they're quite recent dead poets. I don't know how he can afford to publish it because of the copyright fees. But I've been dipping into that just beside my chair. And I would recommend that. I can't be many people who wouldn't find anything in there if they sort of had the patience to look. Although I sort of believe it's important to read the poetry of the past as well. Although perhaps not. And for someone who wants to write poetry, it's important to read the poetry of the past as well. I think it's a shame not to. Do you like Heine?
Oh, yes, I do.
I like Heine too. He's my favourite. Well, it's the only German poet I know anything about, really. But and I discovered my favourite English poet, I think, is A.E. Housman. And I discovered that and then I also got to know some of Heine's poetry. And then I discovered that Housman really liked Heine as well. So I felt very, very pleased about that.
Yeah. And do you read German poetry in German?
I have. What I have is a book of Heine's poetry that has English translations in prose at the bottom of the page. So if I can't understand something, I don't have to get out my dictionary. I've tried reading verse translations of Heine, but they're not very good. I haven't found any good. I have translated a few of Heine's poems, and there's about one or two that I quite like. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult because they're so simple and they rhyme. It's very difficult.
Yeah. And as a translator of poetry, a question I always find interesting, would you try to translate poems that rhyme so that they rhyme in the language they're translated in?
Yes, I do, because my poems, because I write rhyming poetry. And so it seems to me important that if the poem rhymes in the original language, then it should rhyme in English as well. Although I know it can work. The Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva has been important to me. And there are some English I can't read Russian. There are some English translations by Elaine Feinstein, and they don't rhyme, but they're absolutely wonderful. So, and I suppose that's better than a bad rhyming translation. Yeah.
Maybe like already turning towards the end of our conversation for today. Where would you hope the field of poetry developing? Do you see trends or like streams where you hope there's more coming or emerging?
I don't. Oh, trends. The trend here at the moment is very much interest in ethnic minority poets. And fair enough. Perhaps it's their turn. I've had a lot of attention. But that's the only trend I can think of. And also the sort of interest in performance poetry. And I'm a little bit skeptical about performance poetry. I want to know if it works on the page. I'm interested in poems that work on the page and then they can last. I don't know what hopes I have. I just hope that there'll be a few more things in my lifetime that I enjoy, but then there's enough already. I've got if you looked over that, if you could see over that way, there's a whole wall of poetry books. So there's enough. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I can speculate about the future of poetry. I don't think anybody can. I mean, who knows what's going to inspire, who's going to, you know.
Yeah. As you already mentioned the word inspiring just now, and that's actually the final question I usually ask. In this conversation, I would love to ask you to read another poem of yours at the end. But before we turn there, maybe where do you find inspiration currently? I mean, probably also inspiration for your writing projects, but also just like inspiration in sense of getting away from the fear of the moment.
Well, I've been reading a lot. I mean, sometimes I just read crime fiction because I like that a lot, but I've also read quite a lot of non-fiction. I've read some biographies. I've read some novels. I read Hilary Mantel's long novel. Everyone who reads in this country read Hilary Mantel's latest novel when they were in lockdown. Lovely long book to sit down with. And I suppose conversation with my husband. I am in touch with other people, although I don't see them. I'm in touch with some other people. But I think if I read something that makes me laugh, I just read a very funny book, but a comedian called Jeremy Hardy, who died a few years ago. It's a book of his stuff. It's very funny. Anything that makes me laugh makes me feel better. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it does, yeah. And if I may ask, what's a crime author that you can recommend that you like?
Well,
reading?
I mean, I read all of Agatha Christie when I was about 12. I've just read, there's a crime novelist called Sophie Hannah who's written some new Poirot books, and they're very good. Ellie Griffiths, what's the name of that? Fred Vargas, the French one. Mm-hmm. I can't think now. I mean, there's so many. Kana French, Nicky Gerard, Mick. Oh God, what's his name? Mick Heron. I don't know if these are people you've heard of.
Some of them, yeah. Mick Heron, I'm actually.
Dorothy Sayers. You've heard of her?
Yeah.
Dorothy Sayers. Yeah. I shall think of half a dozen now when I'm not. When I'm not talking to you anymore.
But there were a lot of names, and I'll try to put some of them on the website of the podcast so that people can look them up and then go and start their own reading. Thank you very much, Wendy, for the conversation. Like I said, I'm so glad that you agreed to read another poem. And again, I'm curious what you selected as a second poem.
Well, this is a short one, and it's really about living in the present, I think. It's called Every. Every ditch or stream or river the train crosses, every ploughed field, every row of trees, every square church tower in the distance, every minute of sunshine, every shadow, every wisp of cloud in the wide blue East Anglian sky, every day that's left.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for this conversation.
Thank you, Martin. I've enjoyed it.
This was the 67th edition of our podcast, Wie geht's? The cultural sphere during the coronavirus crisis. The poems Wendy Cope has read can also be found, with kind permission by her, on the podcast website, covid-culture.com, where you can also find all previous editions of this podcast in the English language. Our next edition will be in German again, though, and I will talk to Henning Mohr, director of the Institute for Cultural Policy in Bonn, about his first year in office. I'm looking forward to our next editions. Take care. Bis bald. Passen Sie gut auf sich auf.